A woman sits alone in the soft candle light of her chamber, her face lit by the flicker of a flame and the shimmer of her mirror. But this is no ordinary reflection. The powder on her cheeks is made from lead. The rouge on her lips contains cinnabar. Her eyes glow dark with coal crafted from charcoal and fat. She is not preparing for battle. But the ritual is no less exacting, no less dangerous. This is the price of beauty, paid quietly, across thousands of years. In our time, we cleanse and moisturize. We exfoliate, tone, conceal. But in the past, beauty was survival, currency, power, and often poison. Ancient beauty routines were not simply cosmetic. They were deeply woven into the fabric of identity, class, and cultural beliefs. They were also, all too often, deadly. Let us now step backward into dim-lit rooms of marble and dust, into markets where powdered minerals were sold in secret, into baths where perfume masked something far more sinister. Welcome to the hidden, dangerous history of ancient beauty. The mirror has always held a kind of sorcery. It tells a story we want to believe, that we are more than flesh, that we are radiant, desirable, timeless. But what if the reflection lies? What if the glow on your cheeks means your blood is slowly thickening, your organs failing, your mind unraveling? In ancient Rome, aristocratic women prized a pale, almost ghostly complexion. The lighter your skin, the higher your status. Laborers worked outdoors, their sun-darkened faces marked them. But the elite stayed indoors, and whiteness became a badge of luxury. To achieve this, they turned to ceruse, a mixture of vinegar and white lead, a metal that seeps silently into the body. It corrodes the kidneys, it shatters the nervous system, it kills slowly, but ceruse went on smooth and bright. It blurred blemishes, it made a woman glow like marble. She smiled into her mirror, never realizing the makeup would steal her health over time. The longer she used it, the more her skin deteriorated, and so she needed more powder, more poison. This cycle of damage, disguise, and more damage was not unique to Rome. In Elizabethan England, the ideal face was white, flawless, almost otherworldly. Queen Elizabeth I herself used Venetian ceruse. She wore it so often, so thickly, that her real skin became unrecognizable. She, too, was poisoned slowly by her beauty. Some say she wore a death mask long before she died, painted in powder, preserved in fiction. But the mirror didn't care. It only reflected what was shown to it. What's remarkable is how far people went to maintain the illusion. In the 16th century, women rubbed mercury into their skin to fade freckles. They painted their eyelids with soot and lamp black. They rinsed their faces with ammonia from aged urine. There were no dermatologists, there was only trial and error. And often, tragedy. Consider the story of Maria, a wealthy noble woman in Florence in the early 1500s. Her diaries speak of long mornings spent applying a mixture of egg whites and lead paste to her cheeks. She believed it gave her skin a porcelain-like finish. But over the years, her health declined. Her teeth loosened, her hair fell out, her mind began to slip. Physicians called it a mystery illness, but the real culprit stared back at her every morning in the mirror, in the jar, in the powder she so faithfully applied. Ancient Egypt had its own brand of beauty. Women and men used coal, made from crushed galena, a lead-based mineral, to line their eyes. It gave them an alluring, almond-shaped gaze. It was also believed to protect against the evil eye and the desert sun. But galena is toxic. With prolonged use, it could lead to lead poisoning, especially when absorbed through the skin or eyes. Still, it was applied daily, even lovingly. The mirror, again, told only part of the truth. There's something deeply human about this longing for transformation, to polish the outer self, even at the cost of the inner. In ancient Japan, aristocratic women blackened their teeth with a mixture of iron filings and vinegar. The practice, called ohaguro, was believed to enhance beauty and preserve teeth. But the acidic mixture damaged enamel, leading to decay under the surface. In Greece, women used arsenic-based powders for their skin. Arsenic, a substance more commonly associated with murder than moisturizers. Yet, in small doses, it gave a luminous glow. As the saying went, beauty requires sacrifice, and sacrifice they did, not just of time or money but of health, of years of life, of sanity. But this wasn't foolishness. It was desperation, devotion, duty. In many cultures, a woman's worth was tied to her beauty. If her skin was flawless, if her hair was thick, if her cheeks glowed just so, she might marry well, she might rise, she might survive. The mirror was more than glass. It was a gatekeeper, and behind that gate, history reveals a library of strange and perilous rituals. Women wore masks made of crocodile dung and honey. They bathed in milk and sulfur. They burned herbs to perfume their skin. They plucked, waxed, shaved with sharp bronze blades. They massaged snail slime into their faces. They bled themselves to create a more delicate complexion. Each of these practices had meaning. Each had a cost. Even perfumes, seemingly harmless, were made from compounds that could cause migraines, lung irritation, even seizures. Myrrh, cinnamon, and benzo in resin were beautiful scents, but their concentrated forms could damage the senses over time, especially in the poorly ventilated rooms where beauty was crafted. The tragedy, of course, is that many of these women never knew what they were sacrificing. There were no warning labels, no safety studies, only mirrors, and desire. Desire, that ancient force, more powerful than logic. When we imagine ancient beauty, we think of elegance, mystique, regality. But underneath the blush was often a deadly truth, a slow march toward illness. A mirror held in one hand and fate in the other, and yet they continued, because the world watched, because the world judged, because behind the danger was a promise that if they were beautiful enough, they might be chosen, they might be remembered, they might be loved, even if it killed them. She held the jar carefully, as though it were sacred. In a small stone room, deep within a Roman villa, a young woman stirred a paste of white lead and vinegar. The smell was metallic, sharp. Her fingers, pale and dry, moved rhythmically as she mixed. The mirror before her was not made of glass, but polished silver. It reflected only what light allowed, and light was scarce. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the surface, and began to apply the paste. First to her forehead, then her cheeks, then her jaw. Each stroke covered the uneven tones of skin. Each layer made her more ghost-like, more perfect, and more poisoned. Outside, her servants whispered. They had seen the signs: her trembling hands, her bleeding gums, the way she sometimes forgot her own name. But she was of noble blood, and noble beauty came at a noble cost. She believed what the mirror told her. This was not an isolated story. Across the ancient world, the ideal of beauty often came hand in hand with danger, and as the substances became more refined, so too did the effects subtler, but no less fatal. In Persia, women applied a blend of sulfur and alum to their skin to smooth it. It softened the flesh, lightened pigmentation, and burned slightly. The pain was considered part of the process. To cleanse was to suffer. To suffer was to improve. In India, sandalwood paste was mixed with mercury to brighten the skin. The scent was heavenly, the texture luxurious. But mercury, though less aggressive than lead or arsenic, had its own dark properties. Neurological symptoms appeared slowly: tremors, irritability, memory loss. But by the time the damage surfaced, the ritual was already habit. Stopping it seemed more dangerous than continuing. And so it went. In Greece, the philosopher Theophrastus wrote of women using white lead for facial beauty. Even men, especially actors, wore layers of mineral-based powders for the stage. The audience admired them, even envied them. But those who applied the substances day after day bore a different reality. Ulcers, peeling skin, inflammation. There was irony in it all. The very tools used to enhance beauty were the same ones that slowly stripped it away. Skin thinned, hair fell, eyes dulled. But the solution was always more of the same. More powder, more paint, more perfume. In a way, these routines became masked ritual, disguises that shielded the decay beneath. And the mask had power. In high courts and royal chambers, a woman's appearance could determine her influence. If a nobleman was swayed by her grace, her softness, her glow, she might secure marriage, property, even diplomacy. Beauty wasn't simply decoration, it was strategy. But strategy, like any weapon, carries risk. One of the most chilling practices in medieval France was the use of belladonna, known as beautiful woman in Italian. Women dropped tinctures of the deadly plant into their eyes to dilate the pupils. This gave them a wide-eyed, seductive look, but prolonged use blurred vision permanently. In some cases, it caused blindness. Still, the result was captivating. The eyes seemed filled with mystery, emotion, even innocence. Lovers leaned in, unable to resist the stare. The effect was irresistible and irreversible. Even as the body weakened, the mirror rewarded the effort, and that was all that mattered. It is easy, in our modern world, to judge the past, to look at the ingredients: mercury, lead, feces, urine, crushed beetles, and wonder how people could be so reckless. But theirs was not a world of choice. It was a world of expectations, a world where mirrors did not forgive, and the obsession did not stop at the face. Hair was another battlefield. In ancient Egypt, women used lime paste to remove body hair. The mixture burned the skin and sometimes left scars, but smoothness was a sign of refinement. Roughness was considered animalistic. Even the pain was believed to purify. In Renaissance Europe, women plucked their hairlines to create the illusion of a high forehead, which was considered regal. They removed eyebrows completely, rubbed walnut oil on their scalp to thin the hair, and even swallowed arsenic-laced pills to improve skin texture. The deeper the sacrifice, the more serious the devotion. There's a haunting question that echoes through this history. Was it worth it? To glow for a moment, to feel wanted, to be praised in whispers, and then, years later, to rot slowly in silence. But those who lived it rarely thought so far ahead. The mirror asked for more, and they gave it, not out of vanity, but out of duty, out of hope, out of fear. And perhaps because the mirror was the only thing that ever looked back. In a dim villa near Alexandria, a merchant's wife rinsed her face in vinegar soaked with crushed pearls. The pearls were ground to dust, each grain believed to carry mystical power. She was told it would lighten her skin, lift her status, and bring her closer to the gods. But pearls offered no nourishment, only illusion. Her skin flaked, her eyes burned. Still, she continued. She was not alone. In Babylon, women mixed clay and burnt almonds to treat dark spots. The mixture smelled of ash and earth. It stung the skin, turned it red, then left it smooth. At least, that was the promise. Some added powdered copper for color. Others stirred in animal bile for shine. The ingredients varied, but the goal remained the same. Transformation, beauty, in its ancient form, was a kind of alchemy. It was not about health. It was about turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Skin into porcelain, eyes into obsidian, lips into crushed rubies. The cost, often hidden, often paid too late. One scroll found near the ruins of Herculaneum records a formula passed down through generations. White chalk, sheep's fat, and ashes of burned flowers. Women used it as a daily mask. They believed it warded off aging, protected from wind and softened wrinkles. It also clogged pores, introduced bacteria, and caused skin infections. Still, it spread across households like gospel. And yet, the mirror offered its silent approval. Behind every dangerous mixture was a whisper of hope. That youth could be preserved, that beauty could conquer time, that someone might look, and not look away. In ancient China, women used rice water and lead-based powders to whiten their faces. To be pale was to be noble, to be tanned was to be poor. And so, even in dim homes with no audience, They applied the poison patiently, layer by layer. Over years, they did not seek applause, only acceptance. The men did not always see the damage. They saw only softness. They admired the scent of jasmine, not knowing it masked infection. They admired the flush of rouge, not knowing it came from mercury. They admired the glow, not knowing it was fire beneath the skin. In private, many women suffered in silence. When skin began to peel, they called it dryness. When their eyes became cloudy, they blamed the weather. When their moods shifted, their hands trembled, their appetite faded. They told no one, because to admit pain was to invite shame. To admit fear was to risk everything. So they stayed quiet. And the mirror, always the mirror, never argued. There is a story from a small village in the Pyrenees, passed down through lullabies and warnings. A young bride, barely 15, was gifted a set of cosmetics by her new husband. The powders smelled of violets and cloves. She applied them faithfully each morning. By winter, her skin had thinned. By spring, she could barely eat. Her mother-in-law called it weakness. The midwife said it was nerves. She died before her second summer. Her mirror was passed to her sister, who used the same powders with pride. History does not always record names, but it remembers patterns. Over and over. Across lands and languages, we see this: the mirror, the hand, the ritual, the cause, a dangerous devotion, a quiet suffering, a beauty that demanded obedience. But there were those who questioned it. In ancient medical texts, warnings appear small, uncertain notes in the margins. Healers wrote of lead sickness. Monks noted cases of madness in women who used cinnabar on their lips. Herbalists whispered that too much coal could blind. But these voices were faint, and the glamour of beauty louder. Even in temples, the standards remained. Priestesses were expected to glow, to cleanse with ashes and oils, to bathe in rose water mixed with vinegar, to wear powders on feast days. Their purity was judged not only by behavior, but by appearance. The divine demanded radiance, even if it came from poison. One temple inscription reads, "She who is pale like the moon and fragrant as cedar shall walk in favor. She who fades shall be forgotten." Such was the creed of the mirror. And so, every day, across centuries, women looked into that silver surface. They adjusted their veils, applied their powders, smiled through pain. They believed what they were told, that beauty was destiny, that a perfect face could open doors, silence rivals, bend fate. Perhaps it could, but at what cost? The body always remembers. Even when the face glows and the lips curve into a pained smile, the body speaks in other ways, in fatigue, in fever, in the slow unraveling of organs under pressure. Beauty, when built on poison, is a fragile mask, and sooner or later, it cracks. In the shadowed courts of Byzantium, empresses and noble women gathered under domed ceilings and golden mosaics. They drank warm wine and discussed perfumes imported from Arabia, ointments from Egypt, and creams made by monks. Beauty was a currency, traded as carefully as gold. The formulas were secret. The results? Whispered. But behind the glamour was a rigid standard. To be admired was not enough. One had to outshine the others. The competition led to excess. Some dipped cloths in mixtures of lye and vinegar to scrub away freckles and scars. Others used resin and wax to strip their skin bare. There were reports of women bleaching their hair with pigeon droppings and copper filings. When infections followed, they used rose oil to hide the scent of rot, and through it all, they smiled. In the colder reaches of northern Europe, women added powdered chalk to snow water and let it rest overnight. The next morning, they would pat it onto their faces, believing it had absorbed the essence of purity. But chalk clogs, it hardens, it suffocates the skin. In time, it drew moisture out instead of locking it in. Still, it was considered noble, for those without access to powders, alternatives were found. In the alleys of old cities, street vendors sold skin lighteners made from animal fat and burnt bones. The mixtures were gritty, the smell foul. But for a few coins, a girl could look like someone else, someone important, someone seen. Even among servants and peasants, beauty mattered. In rural Asia, women stained their nails red using crushed flower, petals, and sap. In parts of Africa, clay masks were dried in the sun, cracked off at dawn to reveal a new face. In the Americas, ancient tribes decorated their skin with natural dyes, sometimes mixed with ground stone or metallic dust. The more vivid the result, the more respected the wearer. But nature was not always safe. Some tribes unknowingly used toxic berries or metals, believing them to be harmless. Rashes, fever, and fainting followed, but superstition often blamed the spirit world, not the substance, and so the rituals continued. What we now call beauty was once ritual, myth, belief, a way of being, a way of surviving in societies where silence was expected, but appearance was everything. There are records of women boiling herbs late into the night, lavender, sage, marigold, chamomile, then mixing them with ash or milk to create tonics. Some worked, others harmed. Few knew which was which. Mothers passed recipes to daughters. Sisters whispered secrets before weddings. Older women, their faces already worn, watched in silence as the young stepped into the cycle again. And the mirror stayed. In every age, it was the same. The silent observer, the unblinking judge. It reflected youth, then watched it fade. It showed radiance, then scars. It told the truth, but only after the Lee had already taken root. In ancient India, a princess once refused marriage until she had purified herself through 40 days of ritual bathing and skin lightening oils. The texts say her skin shimmered like moonlight afterward. They do not mention the nausea, the migraines, the tremors. They do not say how long the glow lasted, because history forgets the pain. It remembers the portrait, not the illness, the legend, not the truth. But if we listen closely, beneath the silence, we can hear it, the quiet mourning of those who paid for beauty not with silver or gold, but with their bodies. And still, they were admired, painted, praised. In the far corners of ancient kingdoms, love poems were written to women with eyes lined in kohl, skin pale as ivory, lips red from crushed carmine. They were compared to flowers, to moonlight, to divine goddesses. The writers did not know what lay beneath. Or, if they did, they chose to forget, because the illusion was too lovely to question. The mirror, always the mirror, held the fiction, and they accepted it, because sometimes, being beautiful, even briefly, felt like the only power they had, even if it meant disappearing slowly while the world applauded. Time does not remember the mirror. It remembers the face that once stared into it, the powdered cheek, the trembling hand, the eyes that hoped for more. In a forgotten corner of a desert monastery, fragments of glass lie buried beneath layers of sand and time. Once, that shard belonged to a woman who sat each morning with a silver bowl of pigment, a cloth soaked in rose water, and a dream. No one remembers her name, but she was one of thousands, millions across centuries, who practiced the ritual of transformation. Beauty was never idle. It was labor. It was war without weapons. A woman woke not to rest, but to work on her reflection. She pinned her hair, rubbed salves on her arms, soaked her face in mineral oil, crushed beetles for lip color, and when her skin stung or bled, she told herself it meant the treatment was working. In the far hills of Tibet, records tell of young girls rubbing powdered mica across their cheeks to shimmer in candlelight. They danced at festivals, faces shining like the stars above them. But mica, in its raw form, can damage the lungs when inhaled. It clings to the throat. It sharpens the breath. No one saw it happen all at once. But over time, the brightness turned to coughing, then silence. The world rarely linked the glow to the grave. In the palaces of Mughal India, attendants prepared rose-scented paste with mercury to lighten the skin of queens and princesses. These women lived in splendor, gold embroidery, jewels in their hair. But behind the veils, some carried fatigue like a second skin. They forgot their words. Their hearts raced at night. They smiled less often. They aged faster than they should have. No one dared speak the truth. Beauty demanded silence. There's a cruelty to it, the way the most dangerous treatments often gave the best results. The bright sheen, the flawless tone, the unblemished surface. It fooled not just others, but the wearer herself, and so, the cycle fed itself. When damage began to show, the answer was more treatment. When pain appeared, it was buried under thicker masks. And always, the mirror stood ready. It did not reveal. It only returned what it was shown. It's tempting to call it vanity. But it wasn't. Vanity is a luxury. What many ancient women practiced was survival. In a world where they were judged before they were heard, their faces spoke first. A single wrinkle could end a marriage prospect. A blemish could invite gossip. A tired eye could mean a lost opportunity. And so, they fought time with whatever tools they were given, even if those tools destroyed them. In some cases, the danger wasn't hidden. It was embraced. Roman women, well aware of the side effects, continued to use ceruse because it worked. Elizabethan noble women accepted the risk of skin lesions, hair loss, and early death in exchange for the social standing that a white face brought. In places where belladonna was used, blindness was considered a noble sacrifice for beauty. They knew, they chose, because sometimes that fleeting moment of admiration, of control, was worth more than years of safety. And that is perhaps the most haunting part. The mirror did not force them, it only offered the choice, and many chose to believe the reflection, not the risk. To live in the glow, rather than the shadow, and when the glow faded, they were forgotten. But if you stand quietly in a museum, in front of an old portrait or an ancient statue, and look closely, you can still see it. The shimmer of kohl around the eyes, the powdered white skin, the soft, sculpted mouth colored by crushed minerals. Their stories live not in words, but in those faint traces, a history written on skin, a warning in silence, a mirror that still speaks. Even now, she stood by the Nile, her reflection drifting. In the water. The sun was still low, but already it painted the river gold. The reeds whispered, and birds wheeled silently overhead. In her hand was a jar small, carved from alabaster, sealed with beeswax. Inside, the black powder shimmered like obsidian dust. Cold. A sacred substance, a symbol, a shield. She opened the jar and dipped her slender stick into the powder, then gently traced a line beneath her lower eyelid, then the upper. The powder clung like a shadow, darkening the almond shape of her eyes. She did not flinch. She had done this every morning since childhood. It was not merely decoration. In ancient Egypt, beauty was not separate from survival. It was medicine, it was ritual, it was divine. The black kohl, made from crushed galena, a lead-based mineral, was thought to protect the eyes from disease, dust, and spirits. Some believed it deflected the evil eye, others said it honored the gods, especially Horus and Hathor. Men, women, and even children wore it. The eyes were sacred portals. To leave them bare was to invite chaos. And so, every morning, Egyptians outlined their gaze with care. But there was danger in the glow. Galena, the mineral in kohl, contains lead sulfide. Prolonged exposure through the thin skin around the eyes allowed lead to enter the bloodstream. Slowly, silently, over time, it could affect the liver, the brain, the heart. But no one knew. How could they? They saw only its power. The eye rimmed in kohl was mesmerizing. The contrast made the whites appear brighter, the gaze more commanding. It was not just beautiful, it was holy. Priests wore it in temples. Pharaohs wore it in war. Dancers wore it during rituals under the moon. And always, the jar returned, refilled, reused, revered. But kohl was only the beginning. In their pursuit of divine appearance, Egyptians used cosmetics for nearly every part of the body. Their understanding of the connection between health, scent, and appearance was advanced for the time. They bathed daily in perfumed water. They shaved their bodies to avoid lice and odor. They oiled their skin to preserve softness in the harsh, Desert air. To be unclean was to be offensive not just socially, but spiritually. Perfumes were blended from myrrh, frankincense, and lotus. Creams were mixed from honey, castor oil, and milk. But even natural ingredients, in large doses or mixed improperly, could cause rashes, inflammation, or respiratory problems. Still, the body must shine. Women painted their lips with red ochre, a pigment from crushed iron oxide. It was bold, fierce, regal. In some households, the pigment was mixed with animal fat to create a lasting gloss. But iron oxide, like galena, is not benign. Prolonged exposure could damage internal systems, especially when ingested or absorbed. Over time, they did not eat it, but they wore it daily, and beauty was never passive. In the chambers of queens and high-ranking noble women, makeup was applied by servants trained in the sacred process. The ritual was quiet, deliberate. Each motion had meaning. A white paste of chalk and honey for the face, a pink stain from carmine insects for the cheeks, a rinse of rose and salt for the hair. The final touch, a dusting of crushed malachite bright green over the eyelids. Malachite was thought to connect the wearer to the goddess Hathor, bring joy, and protect from illness. But malachite, too, is a copper-based mineral. When inhaled or applied to broken skin, it could harm the lungs, irritate the eyes, and infect the blood. And yet, the glow was undeniable. Green lids, black lines, bronze skin, a face worthy of a statue. And often, that's exactly what they became. Death did not end beauty. It preserved it. In tombs across Egypt, archaeologists have found makeup kits placed beside the dead. Jars of pigment, ivory, sticks, stone palettes. They were tools for the afterlife. Because the gods, too, would see their faces. And beauty, even in death, was a form of reverence. But perhaps, beneath the gold and powder and perfume, there were signs. Teeth worn by grit, livers heavy with metals, hair thinned at the scalp, fingers blackened from constant mixing, skins burned by sun and salt. These were the prices, hidden under the robes, whispered between women, ignored by the mirror, because in Egypt, beauty was not vanity. It was protection, and like all protection, it carried weight. In the shadowed corridors of the palace, beauty was not a choice, it was a role. From the moment a girl was old enough to speak, she was taught how to present herself, not just in words, but in presence, posture, fragrance, light. Her voice had to be soft, her movements elegant, her skin without blemish. These were not suggestions, they were expectations. For those born into the ruling class, servants prepared their ointments daily. Bowls of crushed flowers, jars of almond oil, linen cloths for wrapping and cleansing. They were massaged with unguents that smelled of frankincense and honey. Some formulas included resin from sacred trees or the oily paste of boiled herbs. These treatments soothed the skin, but only when fresh. Left too long in the desert heat, they could ferment, sour, and become toxic. Still, they were applied without hesitation. Even commoners followed beauty rituals, though with fewer luxuries. In the marketplaces of Thebes and Memphis, women traded for pigments made from local minerals. Ochres, clays, and soot were cheap, but effective. They darkened the eyes, brightened the lips, and left a lasting impression in the memory of those who passed. It was not just about vanity. In Egypt, beauty was closely tied to cleanliness, and cleanliness, to virtue, to appear dirty, was to appear ungodly. So even those who could not afford perfume found other means. They smoked their clothing over burning herbs. They braided their hair with sprigs of mint or cinnamon bark. They chewed on sweetened roots to freshen the breath and colored their fingertips with henna before festivals. Henna held power. It was used in births, weddings, and burials. It marked both joy and transformation. Women painted their hands with its deep red stain, believing it brought protection and beauty. But henna could also dry the skin, crack the nails, or cause allergic rashes in those with sensitive flesh. It was a gamble and a sacred one. Some women went further. They exfoliated their skin with fine sand mixed into oils. They bleached scars with sour milk and citrus. They rinsed their mouths with vinegar and copper for whiter teeth. The acids burned, but the smile that followed was praised, and praise was everything. Among the elite, being seen as beautiful could mean the difference between influence and obscurity. It could decide marriage, inheritance, status. It shaped how servants treated you, how merchants bowed, how priests delivered blessings. The consequences were not subtle, they were survival. This wasn't just true for women. Men, too, followed strict regimens. Pharaohs oiled their bodies daily. Their eyebrows were shaped, their faces shaved with precision. Soldiers wore coal to shield their eyes from sun and dust. High priests perfumed their armpits and carried scented cones on their heads that melted slowly during ceremonies, releasing aroma into the air like silent incense. In art, they appeared perfect, strong, clean, golden. But behind the perfection was constant labor, heat, effort, repetition. And risk. Some historians believe that ancient Egyptian cosmetics may have actually helped reduce certain eye infections, thanks to their antibacterial properties, particularly those using lead sulfide in carefully balanced amounts. But such benefits depended on purity, storage, and application, and most mixtures were not consistent. Over time, the repeated use of contaminated coal could damage the eye's surface. Scratches became ulcers, blurred vision followed. For some, blindness came gradually like a shadow growing behind the light, but it was hidden beneath dignity and pride. No one wanted to admit that the very thing meant to protect them might be the source of their decline. That was the paradox. The face painted with care, admired by others, blessed by priests, was also the face slowly eroding from within. The skin that glowed under moonlight carried invisible scars. The breath that smelled of lotus might also carry the sickness of spoiled oils, but the rituals continued, because stopping them would mean more than discomfort. It would mean shame, fear, being seen bare, vulnerable, forgotten. So the mirror was trusted more than the body. In temples, goddess statues were painted coal and colored lips. They were clothed in linen, adorned with beaded wigs, and perfumed, like queens. Worshippers believed the divine favored those who honored appearance. Offerings of beauty, jars of oil, palettes of color, combs and mirrors were laid before stone altars, asking for health, fertility, love. To be beautiful was to be heard by the gods. To be plain was to risk being ignored. And so, from the fields of peasants to the chambers of royalty, from the bustling streets of Memphis to the silent tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the people painted themselves for the world, for each other, and for eternity, not knowing that in some ways they were painting themselves away. In the world of ancient Egypt, beauty was not just worn, it was summoned. Through color, scent, and ritual, people believed they could shape their fate. Every jar, every powder, every oil had purpose beyond the physical. It wasn't enough to look beautiful. One had to feel it, believe it, embody it, and in doing so, channel the gods. Cosmetics were often stored in carved containers shaped like lotus buds or falcons. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were sacred symbols. The lotus represented rebirth. The falcon, the divine eye of Horus. To dip a brush into such a vessel was to invoke power. To anoint the body was to protect the soul. Some women whispered prayers as they outlined their eyes in kohl. Others spoke spells as they massaged scented oils into their skin. These weren't empty gestures. They believed that beauty strengthened their life force. A clean, radiant body was more resistant to disease, misfortune, even curses, and so, the lines between magic and medicine blurred. Herbalists prepared beauty formulas with the same precision as healing tonics. They wrote instructions on papyrus scrolls in quiet corners of temples. Recipes included rare ingredients, resin of acacia trees, powdered lapis lazuli, soaked in date wine. Some were designed to reduce wrinkles, others were love charms in disguise, but not all mixtures were safe. One scroll speaks of a skin clearing, paste made from honey, salt, and powdered limestone. Another lists a hair-restoring potion made of crocodile fat and crushed beetles. Some methods worked, others burned, scarred, and sickened. But without modern science, results were judged by appearance, not by internal cost. A glowing face was good, the aching beneath it was ignored. There's evidence of women using arsenic sulfide as a cosmetic pigment, especially in mixtures designed to lighten skin or add shimmer. Arsenic gave a soft radiance, a smooth texture. But even in small doses, it could affect digestion, respiration, and nerve function. Prolonged exposure led to internal decay, slow and silent. Still, the mirror showed no warning, and so they continued. Priestesses, trained in sacred rituals, took these routines further. Before holy festivals, they bathed for hours in perfumed water, then coated their bodies in sacred oils. They wore wigs laced with gold threads and adorned their limbs with copper and turquoise. Their faces were painted with malachite and soot, and their nails dyed with henna and crushed berries. They became living statues, symbols of divine order. But even in these high places, the dangers persisted. Scented oils, when stored improperly, turned rancid and toxic. Heavy wigs trapped heat, causing sores. Long exposure to metallic powders, especially those with copper or lead, irritated the skin, clouded the eyes, and weakened the immune system. Yet stopping was never an option, because to appear unclean before the gods was a sin. To appear dull before the pharaoh was treason, and to appear imperfect in the eyes of society was failure. So the cycle turned in. Every district, beauty merchants sold powders in cloth bundles. Women met at wells and rubbed their arms with pumice stones. Mothers taught their daughters how to darken lashes, how to perfume wrists, how to blend ground minerals with oil and ash to achieve the perfect color. And if the body protested, if the skin cracked, the eye stung, the head ached, they called it the cost of elegance. Some healers warned of sicknesses linked to cosmetics. They noted trembling limbs, blackened gums, dizzy spales. But such warnings were rarely heeded. After all, the face looked fine. And what could be wrong if one still appeared beautiful? That was the great illusion. The same substance that gave the skin its shine also pulled the strength from the bones. The same color that brought a compliment also carried decay. And the mirror, patient and silent, reflected only what was painted on. But perhaps the most haunting truth was this. The women did not believe they were suffering. They believed they were fulfilling their role. They had seen their mothers do it, their grandmothers, their sisters. Beauty was a gift passed down, a burden worn with pride. The act of painting the face was not simply habit, it was identity. Even the dead wore it. Inside tombs, mummified faces were sometimes touched with pigment, lips red, eyes lined, perfume cones placed near the head, meant to melt and release fragrance in the afterlife. The gods, they believed, would be pleased by the scent, would recognize the soul beneath the skin, would see the glow and open the gates. The scent of oil drifted through the narrow alleys of Thebes. It clung to linen robes, soaked into clay walls, floated above the morning markets, and from the scent alone, one could guess who passed through. Sandalwood meant nobility, myrrh and frankincense wealth, fish oil and garlic, a servant, or worse, a labor returning from the fields. In Egypt, beauty was more than appearance. It was a language, and scent spoke volumes. Among the upper class, a woman's fragrance entered the room before she did. Her eyes were darkened, her cheeks powdered, her hair oiled smooth. She carried herself not just with pride, but with purpose. Her beauty was armor, and every detail, every scent, every shine was carefully chosen. To be seen was to be protected. To be admired was to be safe. But this protection was not equal. In the desert villages, women had fewer choices. Their cosmetics came from local clays, burnt herbs, bits of charcoal. A mirror, if they had one, was not polished bronze, but still water in a bowl. Their oil was animal fat, not pressed almond. Their scent came from sweat and ash, not roses. Still, They followed the rituals as best they could, because beauty wasn't just for the wealthy. It was expected of all. A bride, even from a poor family, was prepared with care. Her mother applied a paste of flour and honey to her face. Her sisters braided her hair with dried flowers. Someone lit incense. Someone sang a prayer. Someone prepared a mixture of crushed dates and herbs to rub into her hands and feet. No one questioned it. To be unprepared was to bring shame not just on oneself, but on the family, even slaves. When, allowed, decorated themselves with ochre and henna. Some braided charms into their hair. Some rubbed their skin with salt to appear more radiant in torchlight. Their beauty was not for themselves. It was survival, a way to avoid punishment, a way to be chosen instead of ignored. Beauty became currency. And currency could be spent or stolen. The ancient texts speak of women accused of sorcery simply for being too beautiful. It was believed that a certain look of flawless glow, a powerful scent, a gaze lined dark could cast a spell. Some said women used enchanted perfumes to lure men. Others claimed a coal line that could curse rivals. These beliefs weren't always superstition. They were fear wrapped in ritual. A woman who controlled how she appeared controlled how others felt. And that power was unsettling. So beauty, while admired, was also policed. In certain temples, only specific pigments were allowed. In some regions, only high-ranking women could wear perfumes made from imported spices. Laws were drawn, rules were whispered, and always, the mirror waited reflecting both worship and suspicion. But despite the risks, the rituals continued, because underneath everything status, wealth, rank was the quiet truth that beauty made one visible. In a world of gods and kings, to be seen was to be remembered. And for many, that was the only legacy they could hope for, even in death. The tombs of the wealthy were filled with cosmetics. They believed their journey to the afterlife required the same preparation as life itself: oils to anoint, powders to protect, scented wax cones to melt slowly beside the soul as it traveled. They imagined the gods would meet them in light, not shadow, and so, their final form must be perfect. But what the tombs do not show is the cost paid along the way, the coughs ignored, the skin burns hidden beneath gold, the trembling hands that still traced cold before the mirror. Long after the body had begun to fail, the glow remained, even when the strength behind it faded. Because in ancient Egypt, beauty was not a reward. It was a duty, a ritual, a shield against invisibility. And those who bore it, rich or poor, noble or enslaved, carried it like armor. Even as it cracked, even as it poisoned, even as it turned their skin to stone beneath the sun, the tomb was sealed for centuries. Sand drifted against its stone entrance. Wind whispered through reeds along the Nile. Inside, darkness wrapped around the stillness like silk. And yet everything remained: a mirror of bronze, a jar of coal, a comb carved from ivory, worn smooth by fingers long turned to dust. She had prepared for this moment. Her body lay wrapped in linen, her skin oiled with myrrh. Her lips, though dry now, were once stained with crushed carmine. Her eyes, closed forever, had once held the dark rim of sacred powder. A priest had said her name aloud, guiding her soul into the next world. He spoke of beauty, of grace, of favor with the gods, and beside her, the tools she used to shape herself every day, every year, every breath waited silently. Time cannot erase what beauty once meant. The body, yes, it decays. The pigment fades, the scent dissolves into stone. But the act remains, the intention, the devotion, the belief that to shape the surface was to protect the soul, that to glow, even briefly, was to live with purpose. Archaeologists uncover these traces like secrets whispered in silence. They study palettes stained with green malachite. They test jars still holding the dust of galena. They examine wigs, beads, pins, brushes. They hold these objects and wonder not only what they were used for, but why. The answer, always the same. To be seen. To be remembered. To be worthy of something greater. The danger, of course, was not always known, and when it was buried. Beneath hope, that this salve might bring youth, that this oil might bring favor, that this scent might turn the head of a pharaoh or a god. Even when the body said no, the mirror said yes, and the mirror had the final word. In ancient stories, gods appeared as golden beings, radiant, perfect, untouchable, and mortals, wanting to be near them, mimicked that light. They coated their skin, lined their eyes, sweetened their breath, not to deceive but to ascend, to rise above the dust of the world, if only for a moment, and perhaps they did. Perhaps in the flicker of an oil lamp, or the hush of a sacred prayer, a woman saw herself not as weak or flawed but as divine. And in that moment, the poison didn't matter, the powder didn't matter. The weight of ritual fell away. Only the glow remained, that is the legacy left in stone and sand. Not just the beauty itself but the longing behind it, the courage to become more, the quiet strength it took to believe that transformation was possible even at great cost, because for them, beauty was not a surface. It was a path, and though that path was lined with danger, it was also filled with light, a shimmer, across still water, a breath of perfume in desert air, a hand reaching for the mirror. Once more, before the gods arrived, the villa stood quiet on the hillside. Marble columns gleamed in the morning sun, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Birds chirped in the garden. A breeze carried the scent of rosemary and crushed laurel. Inside, a Roman matron sat before her mirror, already dressed in white linen. Her skin, pale and powdered, shimmered faintly in the light. This was not a luxury, it was routine. For a woman of standing in ancient Rome, beauty was a performance staged every day. Every detail mattered. The shade of her cheeks, the curl of her hair, the scent trailing behind her as she walked through the atrium. She was judged by what could be seen long before anyone cared to ask who she was. So she prepared. Her servant opened a small ivory box and revealed the paste. White lead, mixed with vinegar and beeswax. It was cool to the touch. She nodded, and the servant began dabbing it across her cheeks, forehead, chin. The paste dried quickly, creating the illusion of porcelain skin. But beneath the glow, something else was happening. The lead seeped through the pores. It gathered in the blood. It poisoned quietly, slowly, without a sound. And yet, this was the standard of Roman beauty. Pale skin meant purity. Pale skin meant status. Only women who stayed indoors, who didn't labor under the sun, could afford to be that color. To be tanned was to be common. To be brown was to be overlooked. So the women of Rome painted themselves pale, even when it made them sick. The use of white lead, or cherusa, became widespread in upper-class households. Recipes for it were passed down between women, shared in bathhouses, scribbled in the margins of scrolls. Physicians warned of its dangers, but they were ignored. Appearance carried more weight than health. And the powder worked at least on the surface. But over time, skin thinned. Mouths dried, hair fell out, muscles weakened. Some women became moody, forgetful, withdrawn. Still, they returned to the mirror each morning, applied the paste, and smiled, because the ritual wasn't just about looking good. It was about control. In a society where men governed law, politics, where women controlled perception, and beauty was their most powerful tool. In the Roman Republic and later the Empire, a woman's face could open doors, shape alliances, command attention in ways law could not. So they learned to craft it well. Rouge was made from red ochre, or sometimes from the dangerous mineral cinnabar, rich in mercury. Lips were colored with mulberry juice or beetle dye. Eyes were lined with soothe, or antimony powder, a silvery substance mined from the east. Each element came with a price. Cinnabar, when absorbed, affected the nervous system. Antimony blurred vision and damaged the lungs when inhaled. But in front of the mirror, those risks faded. All that remained was the transformation, the face in the glass. The power it carried. And the power it demanded, because beauty was not Passive in Rome, it was theatrical. At feasts, women competed silently across tables, who shined brightest in torchlight, who carried the scent of jasmine, not sweat, who had the smoothest brows, the rosest cheeks, the most sculpted hands. A glance could wound, a smile could destroy, cosmetics became weapons. Not everyone could afford them, of course. The finest pigments came from distant provinces, India, Egypt, Hispania. Only the elite could import saffron for perfume, or gold dust for body shimmer. Common women used ashes and flour. They imitated what they saw, but never quite matched it. The divide was clear. Even among slaves, appearance mattered. Young servant girls were often groomed and painted to appeal to their masters. Their faces became property. Their hair, styled and perfumed, was not for themselves. They were expected to reflect the household's wealth like furniture polished. Each morning. It was a system, quiet, ruthless, normal. And at the center of it all, the mirror remained, polished bronze, sometimes silver, sometimes glass backed with mercury. The image it returned was always slightly off-warped by the surface, but the women accepted it, believed in it, trusted it more than their own reflection in water. Because it showed them who they were supposed to be, not who they really were. The steam rose in columns through the caldarium. Within the stone walls of Rome's great bathhouses. Beauty was shaped in silence. Naked bodies moved through shadow and mist. Women of wealth, women of status, women burdened by expectation. Their attendants waited with cloths, oils, and scraping tools. And all around them, the sound of water echoed like breath. This was where the skin was reborn. First, the sweat, the hot air softened the body, opened the pores, readied the flesh. Then came the stridula, a curved blade of bronze used to scrape away sweat, oil, and dirt. Sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, the goal was purity. Not just cleanliness, but transformation. Then the oils. Perfumed with myrtle, spikenard, or saffron, the oils were rubbed into the skin while still warm. Fingers moved across shoulders, thighs, temples. A ritual of softness, a moment of pleasure, but also preparation. Because only once the skin was softened could the pigments adhere properly. Beauty required a blank canvas. And once that canvas was made white, clean, fair color could be added again. In private chambers, women reapplied their lead paste, their rouge, their soot. They traced their brows with burnt cork, dabbed their lips with wine-stained cloth. In the mirror, they looked radiant, untouchable, divine. But under the surface, the damage deepened. The oils they used were not always pure. Some were cut with animal fat, others with bitter resins that caused rash and inflammation. The rouge contained mercury, the soot contained tar. Day after day, these toxins layered onto the body, absorbed through heat, through pores, through ritual, and no one stopped because aging was not permitted. A wrinkle was shame, a sunspot, failure, a sagging jawline, a quiet death. In a world ruled by perfection, even the illusion of youth was a form of protection. A woman who aged was replaced, a wife who faded was ignored, a courtesan who lost her shine lost her income. To survive, one had to glow, even if the glow came from poison. So recipes grew more daring. Some women applied boiled mouse brains to their faces, believing it preserved softness. Others used crushed pearls dissolved in vinegar, a treatment favored by Cleopatra, if legends are to be believed. The mixture burned the tongue and throat when ingested, but it promised radiance, a beauty born from discomfort. The discomfort was worn in silence, because Roman society demanded that elegance never appear difficult. The polished face was meant to look effortless, as if the skin had simply been born that smooth. The scent that clung to robes was not supposed to reveal how many ingredients it took to blend. The mirror, once again, became a mask, a polished lie. Even hair became part of the game. Blondes were rare in Rome. So, women bleached their hair with goat urine and ashes. The mixture stung. It dried the scalp, but blondes were exotic, fashionable, and so the hair turned brittle, and fell, and was replaced with wigs made from the heads of northern slaves. Hair stolen, then perfumed, then worn as pride. Wigs were washed in rose water, combed with ivory, powdered with chalk. But they, too, carried risks, lice, infection, rot. Some women developed sores on their scalp from pins and glue. Others became allergic to the oils, but the wig stayed, because Bear was not beautiful. Not in Rome. And through it all, the mirror waited. It saw every flaw before it appeared, every fine line, every sunspot. It reminded the wearer that time was moving, that youth was fading, that her value, perhaps, was slipping away, and so, she painted faster, layered deeper, smiled harder, all while the lead beneath her skin worked slowly toward the heart. The door closed with a soft click behind her. The city's noise, chariots, footsteps, voices faded away. In this room, silence reigned. A single oil lamp flickered against the polished wall. On the marble table before her lay the tools of transformation. Jars of pigment, bowls of crushed herbs, brushes of bone and ivory, cloth steeped in perfume. She had an hour before he arrived, time enough to become someone else. She picked up the white lead paste first, not because she wanted to, but because she must. The man who paid for her company expected pale skin, the kind only noble women possessed. She was not noble, but tonight she would appear to be. The cold paste touched her cheek. She worked quickly, spreading it with practiced hands, avoiding her eyes. Too much and her skin would sting all night. Too little and he'd see the truth. Over this, she dusted crushed pearls, giving her face a faint shimmer. Her reflection smiled back at her. It was not her, but it was someone beautiful, and that was enough. In Rome, courtesans understood the rules of beauty better than anyone. Their lives depended on illusion. They were not wives. They were not protected. They had only their minds, their wit and their appearance. So they studied. They learned how to blend colors to soften their features. They painted their eyelids with saffron for warmth, with ash for shadow. They rimmed their eyes in anemone, knowing it burned, but liking the way it made their gaze look deeper. They soaked their lips in red wine and rubbed their teeth with powdered pumice to make them shine. They walked into rooms like goddesses and left them tired, trembling, stained. Their beauty was a performance, and performances have consequences. Many courtesans suffered from constant migraines, from skin lesions that would not heal, from fatigue that crept in slowly and stayed, but they never complained. There was always another to take their place, another face, younger, fresher, unmarked. So they smiled harder, stood straighter, painted more, but noble women suffered too. Behind the walls of Rome's villas, women of rank followed their own rituals. Attendants brought warmed oils and crushed berries. They soaked in milk baths scented with violets and honey. They wore emeralds around their necks and believed the stones brought clarity to the eyes. They placed lead paste on their arms, chest, and neck, not just their face. Their beauty was not for survival. It was for control. A noble woman's power came through appearance. If her skin glowed, guests listened. If her hair was thick and styled high, rivals took notice. If her scent lingered long after she left the room, men spoke of her days later. She could not vote, she could not fight, but she could conquer in silence. And yet, the same poisons lived in her powders, the same ache crept into her chest, the same tremors in her hands. She forgot words, lost weight, bled without cause. But no one connected it to the mirror. They blamed bad air, bad spirits, old age, never the lead, never the mercury, never the price of elegance. In rare moments of honesty, some women wrote of their suffering. One described her skin as paper, flaking in the wind. Another wrote of a headache so deep it pulled the stars down from the sky. But those writings were private, not meant for the world. The public saw only the glow, and so the glow continued. Even at funerals, the rituals remained. A noble woman's body was washed, anointed, painted. Her cheeks were colored, her lips brushed red, her hair perfumed. She was dressed in her finest gown. Those who came to pay respects did not see death. They saw beauty preserved frozen perfect as if even in death, the illusion had to remain. In the lower streets of Rome, far from the Senate halls and garden courtyards, the air smelled different, less of jasmine, more of smoke. The stones were cracked, the walls closed together. Here, the women lived with less but expected no less of themselves. They had no marble tables, no imported oils, no silks from the east, but they had mirrors. They had cloth, they had ash, and sweat, and sun. And they had knowledge. A midwife, bent with years, prepared her face before going out. She dabbed her cheeks with crushed rose petals soaked in water. It gave her no color, but it gave her confidence. Another woman, a widow, traced her eyelids with soot from the stove. Not for vanity, but for strength. It was how she remembered her mother. How her mother remembered hers. In Rome, even the forgotten wore beauty like memory. They couldn't afford pearl dust or imported cinnabar, but they knew where to find color. Beet juice, red clay, the inside of walnut shells. Some used chalk scraped from ruined statues. Others used vinegar to clean their skin, even when it stung. A burn was better than being called unkempt. Even slaves, especially slaves, were expected to appear presentable. Some were bathed and oiled before guests arrived. They were painted with pigments they did not own, made to smile with stained lips. Their hair curled with heated irons, even when it blistered their scalp. Their beauty did not belong to them. It was worn, then erased. Every night, the pigments came off with spit and cloth, the oils with cold water and ash. And beneath it all, the same skin, tired, raw, quiet, but still alive. These women knew something others did not. They knew that the glow was a mask, that the powder was a shield. They had seen noble women cry when the rouge ran, seen courtesans faint from mercury. They understood the danger in every jar, every brushstroke. But still, they followed the ritual, because ritual gave shape to the day. A pot of ash and oil wasn't just makeup, it was a beginning. A moment of control in a world with none, a choice, however small. A reminder that the body still belonged to them, even if only for a while. And sometimes, in these streets, beauty became rebellion. A slave might mix a forbidden pigment to red, to bold. A widow might wear a scent meant for brides, just because she could. A girl might carve a comb from scrap bone and pass it down through generations, each tooth worn smooth by time. These acts were not loud, but they mattered, because they said, I am still here. And yet, even here, the dangers crept in. Lead was found in cheap powders, mercury in common skin bombs, antimony in soot gathered from alley fires. No one was safe. Not truly. The poisons did not care how much coin was spent. They entered the body with the same silence, traveled the same blood, left the same bruises, and, always, the mirror waited. In the simplest homes, it hung on a nail-dull bronze, scratched and blurred, but still, it showed a face. And the face, however poor, however tired, was still painted, still seen, still beautiful. In its own way, the empire crumbled slowly, not with a single fire, or one last war, but through time, through shadows lengthening across marble, through silence creeping into temples, through weeds pushing through cracks in stone. Rome faded, but the mirrors remained, buried in soil, sealed in tombs, forgotten in collapsed villas and worn-out baths. Some were shattered, some still whole. Archaeologists would later lift them with gloved hands, careful, reverent, and in the faint reflection, they saw not themselves, but her, the woman who once sat before it, the face now gone, the paint now dust, but the ritual still here. In broken jars of lead paste, in stained applicators made from swan bone, in pigment, bowls lined with the red trace of cinnabar, in combs missing teeth, but still carved with care, in hairpins laid beside skeletons, curled into once perfect coils. They tell a story, not of vanity, but of belief, that beauty mattered. that the shaping of a face meant something, that the effort to glow, to shine, to appear radiant was more than appearance. It was memory, it was defiance. It was the quiet declaration that even in a world ruled by men, by war, by politics, the body still had power. She left no scrolls, no laws, no armies, but she left this, a trace of color, a scent in stone, a mirror, patiently waiting. And what did it see? Not the poison, not the pain, but the persistence, the hand that returned each morning. The woman who looked into her reflection not to admire it, but to armor it, to shape what the world could see, even if the world never asked what was beneath. That is what outlived Rome. Not only the aqueducts, not only the language, but the powder on a woman's cheek. The curl of hair shaped with oil and fire. The hush of abathhouse. The shimmer of pearl dust across tired skin. And in this, something eternal, because even now, centuries later, when we hold those fragments, when we peer into their mirrors, when we trace the same lines across our own faces, we continue what they began, a ritual, a memory, a soft echo of beauty and everything it tried to protect. The candles flickered in the convent cell. The stone walls were thick, damp with the breath of winter. Outside, snow fell softly across the monastery grounds. Inside, a young woman knelt before a wooden mirror, the surface clouded with age. Her fingers trembled as she traced her face bare, pale, unpainted, but not untouched. She had bled herself the night before, just a little, from the arm. To release the bad humors, they said, to keep the skin pure. In medieval Europe, beauty was not bold. It was quiet, modest, controlled. A pale face meant holiness, a thin body meant discipline, a lowered gaze meant virtue, and women who wished to be admired had to first be invisible. The painted Roman courtesan was gone. Now came the saint, and the saint did not wear rouge, but even saints had secrets. In the halls of noble courts and hidden corners of peasant homes, women still pursued beauty. They just did it in whispers, in shadows, in silence, and often, in pain. They rubbed their skin with raw bread soaked in vinegar. They bled themselves to drain heat from the body, believing it softened the complexion. They wore tight linen across the face overnight, hoping to press out wrinkles. Some even bound their foreheads, believing it would make their eyes look larger, more spiritual. The goal was to look untouched by desire, but the effort was anything but pure. Among noble women, appearance was still curtsy. A girl entering court for marriage was expected to be spotless. She was scrubbed with milk and rose water, her eyebrows plucked thin, or shaved entirely because a broad, open forehead was the fashion of the day. Her lips were left bare, but bitten until red. Her cheeks, unpainted, were pinched before entering the hall. No pigment, only pain, because pigment was sin. To wear makeup in medieval Europe was to invite suspicion. Pain belonged to actresses, to prostitutes, to witches. The church whispered that those who darkened their lashes or reddened their lips were mocking God's creation. And so, women learned to suffer beautifully without being seen suffering. Bloodletting became common. Not just for illness, but for glow. A pale face was the ideal, and any sign of health, rosy cheeks, plumpness, vitality, was to be reduced. Women fasted, walked for hours, sat in cold water, all to maintain the fragile look of purity. But beneath the fabric and ritual, danger grew. They used lead powders, just like Rome, but now they hid them in jars marked as medicine. They applied vinegar-soaked cloths that burned the skin, calling it treatment. They pulled teeth to sharpen their jawlines. They covered sores with crushed lily petals, believing flowers had holy healing power. The line between beauty and penance blurred, and the mirror still present, still watching, reflected not pride, but guilt. A woman might glance at her face only briefly, then cross herself, as if ashamed to look, as if the desire to appear beautiful was something to confess. But, still, she returned to the mirror the next day. Because even holiness needed a face. Even virtue had to be seen. She gathered herbs by candlelight. Chamomile, sage, rosemary, dried and hung from the wooden beams above the hearth. In medieval Europe, the garden was more than food, it was the pharmacy, the vanity table, the place where beauty and healing touched hands. Women learned early, they were taught, which plants calmed the skin, which softened scars, which made the breath sweet. These remedies were not spoken of loudly, they were passed down in kitchens, whispered between sisters, tucked inside prayer books. Beauty had to wear the mask of health. Because to say it aloud, to say, I want to be beautiful, was dangerous. So they said, I want to be clean, I want to be well. And no one questioned that. In the cloisters of monasteries, nuns created balms from beeswax and rose oil, not for vanity, but for purity. They mixed almond paste to soften hands cracked from winter's cold. They crushed lavender into vinegar to rinse the scalp. They made mouthwashes from mint and sage, calling it devotion. The church allowed what was framed as care, not seduction. Never allure. And yet, the rituals looked the same. A clean face, a scented body, a glow in the cheek from a cup of warmed wine. Even silence can carry beauty. Among noble women, ingredients grew more exotic. They imported cinnamon, saffron, myrrh. They paid coin for powdered pearl, for crushed coral, for ambergris from distant oceans. These were stirred into lotions, worn in pendants, soaked into cloth. Some believed ambergris, though it smelled of rot, kept the skin young. Others wore vinegar-soaked sponges beneath their gowns, believing it warded off disease and odor. And behind closed doors, they experimented. A bath in goat's milk, a paste of ground almonds, and a hair rinse made from nettles and rain water. They tested, they suffered, they learned, but they never spoke of it, because to speak was to sin. The church warned that vanity was the devil's mirror, that to alter the body was to insult the Creator, that women who painted their faces would be unrecognizable on Judgment Day, and their souls turned away. So, women turned inward. They painted less, hid more, whispered often, but they never stopped, because even in a world of silence, the desire remained. To be seen. To be chosen. To feel worthy in the eyes of God and man. And for many, this desire carried them to strange places. Some drank herbal potions to stay slim. Others wore amulets to ward off freckles. A few rubbed lead mixed with vinegar across their cheeks, knowing it burned, but liking the way it lightened their skin. There were records of women washing in lye, of using leeches to draw blood from their faces, of fasting for days to keep their hands thin. The mirror was not gone. It was only quieter. Dusty. Waiting. Hung on wooden beams in small stone houses, tucked away in noble bedrooms behind heavy drapes, hidden in corners of monasteries. The mirror waited for a face, and the face, no matter how modest, always returned, because even the most pious soul wants to be remembered. They whispered her name behind doors, a queen, a healer, a poisoner, a saint. No one agreed who she was. Only that her skin glowed like marble, that her hair never grayed, that her voice could calm a crowd or condemn it. She claimed no magic, only herbs. But the world saw more. In medieval courts, beauty and danger were never far apart. A woman who looked too young for her age invited questions. A woman whose face remained untouched by time drew suspicion. Queens were expected to glow, but only from virtue, not from secrets, not from potions, and certainly not from power they'd gathered themselves. One queen, it was said, bathed in wine each week. Another soaked her linens in rose oil and wrapped them around her face at night. A third used crushed emeralds to whiten her skin. These stories slipped between truth and myth, embroidered by servants, repeated by midwives, reshaped by fear, because a beautiful woman who needed no man to preserve her image was unnatural, or worse, enchanted. The church gave these women a name. Which. And with that word, beauty itself became dangerous. If a woman used herbs to soften her skin, she was a healer unless the skin grew too pale. If she used a tincture to dye her lips, She was clever unless the red lingered too long. If she had smooth skin in winter, or thick hair in old age, or eyes that gleamed brightly in candle light, she was marked not by time, but by suspicion. They burned some of them, others were drowned. Some simply vanished, taken by rumor, erased by fear. But their rituals remained hidden in gardens, scratched into margins of family Bibles, passed down in recipes disguised as remedies, because even fear cannot erase desire, and the desire to be beautiful, calm, composed, radiant outlived every accusation. Even among mystics and pilgrims, the longing endured. They were women who fasted not just for God, but for clarity. For that hollow, holy looked the bones sharp, the eyes glowing with prayer. Some rubbed ash into their skin to appear humble. Others painted faint circles under their eyes, mimicking the weariness of saints. The performance of piety had its own mirror, and even among the condemned, beauty lived on. A prisoner might tie her hair with thread, braided to calm her thoughts. A widow might smooth her cheeks before morning, not for others but for herself. A mother might paint her daughter's lips with berry juice just once, before she wed, whispering that she to deserve to feel radiant. And in every case, the ritual was quiet, a breath, a touch, a moment in the dark. The world began to shift, slowly, like the turning of a great wheel. The heavy cloak of medieval stillness loosened. Towns grew. Markets swelled. Ideas moved faster. And with them, beauty began to rise again, not boldly, not yet, but with the quiet confidence of a flame finding breath. In the private studies of scholars and alchemists, strange powders were ground. Gold, sulfur, quicksilver, some were meant to cure, others to purify. But many were meant to transform the body, to make the skin flawless, to preserve youth. They called it medicine, they called it science, but the women who used it called it hope. A new kind of face emerged in the later, medieval world, smooth, pale, gleaming. The ideal was porcelain, cold and clean, untouched by heat or sun. A woman was not to be red-cheeked or strong. She was to be delicate, like parchment, like ivory. To achieve this, the recipes turned darker. Lead was used, more than ever white lead mixed with vinegar, oil, or egg. Applied daily, the skin burned, peeled, and then appeared softer. The damage was blamed on age, on weather, on fate. Not on the mirror. Men began to write beauty manuals, treatises, disguised as philosophy. They gave lists of how a woman should look: wide forehead, arched brows, pale skin, small mouth, lowered eyes. Beauty was not just admired, it was instructed. Women listened. Some plucked their hairline to raise their forehead. Others bleached their brows with urine and sun. Lips were rubbed raw with cloth until they turned red. Teeth were cleaned with powdered bone. Nails polished with wool and vinegar. 1,000 small rituals, hidden behind quiet doors. In public, they were veils. But under the veil, the mask remained. Perfume, too, changed. The scent of the body was still seen as suspect, but not entirely. A woman who smelled faintly of rose or violet was seen as blessed. So dried petals were sewn into gowns, lavender sachets tucked into sleeves, clove and cinnamon chewed to sweeten the breath. If a woman had money, her scent floated through the room like silk. If she did not, she found other ways, rubbing lemon on her hands, washing with herbs, burning rosemary in the corners of her home. To mask the air, the poor did not stop seeking beauty. They simply changed the tools, and sometimes they suffered more. Cheap powders contained ground glass. Cheap perfumes were laced with turpentine. Cheap ointments turned skin gray, then green. But the mirror still waited, even in the smallest homes, and the face that stared back still hoped. Not for perfection. Lust for a trace of light. Even the most modest girl wanted to feel lovely, just once, for the harvest festival, for her wedding, for herself. And so, late at night, she lit a candle, opened her only jar of paste, smoothed her hair, and smiled not at the world, but at her own reflection. a private triumph, a soft rebellion, a whisper against time. The cathedral bells rang across the valley. Slow, deep, carried by wind through stone villages and empty fields. Inside her cottage, an old woman stirred her pot, the scent of rosemary rising with the steam. Her fingers were stained from years of herbs, her eyes clouded, her back bent, but her mirror still hung on the wall. Small, cracked, bronze turned dark with age. She hadn't looked into it in days, maybe weeks, but tonight, something pulled her toward it. Maybe memory, maybe ritual, maybe the quiet ache of wanting to feel like herself again. She reached for the lavender oil she'd saved, rubbed it gently on her wrists, smoothed her hair with a damp cloth, touched her cheeks with rose water, cold from the winter air. And then, slowly, she met her reflection. It no longer looked like youth, but it looked like her. And that was enough. Through the long centuries of the medieval world, beauty had been pushed into corners, tied to morality, muffled by rules. It was told to hide, to humble itself, to never speak too loudly. But it never died. It lived in the pressed flowers between pages, in the faint perfume left on a linen collar, in the smoothing of a braid, in the lighting of a candle before the mirror. It lived in ritual, in longing, in silence. The lead paste wore away skin, the false promises hurt many, but the act of trying, of preparing the body, of crafting the face remained deeply human, not just for others, not just for praise, but for self, for the belief that we are allowed to shape the way the world sees us. Even when the world insists we shouldn't. And so the mirror endured. It traveled from villa to convent to cottage, from marble halls to straw huts, and each woman who looked into it, no matter her age, her name, her status, asked the same quiet question: am I still here? The answer, always, was yes. In the worn brush, in the scent of rosemary, in the reflection of eyes that had seen war, childbirth, hunger, joy, in the slight smile that formed not for beauty itself, but for the right to seek it, because even when the world said no, she still reached for the mirror and touched her face, and remembered. The paintings began to glow. Skin like porcelain, lips like crushed cherries, hair spun gold beneath crowns of pearls. The Renaissance had arrived, and with it, a new obsession with beauty, one not whispered in corners, but celebrated on canvas, sculpted in marble, displayed in courts. The age of hiding was over. Now, to be seen was the gold. In the palaces of Florence and Venice, noble women stepped from shadow into candlelight. Their gowns shimmered with silk and embroidery, jewels danced at their throats, their faces flawless, pale, gleaming, seemed to float above the world, as if untouched by breath or blood. But the glow came at a price. Behind the radiance was pain, because Renaissance beauty did not come naturally. It was painted, crafted, layered over skin until the face no longer belonged to time. They called it la bella figura, the beautiful figure. Not just posture or poise, but perfection in every detail. And at its core was the face, the smooth, white mask of idealized femininity. And to create it, they turned once again to lead. Venetian cires, a thick, white paste made from powdered lead, vinegar, and water. It covered blemishes, smoothed lines, hid freckles and scars. Women wore it daily, for years. At first, it created a luminous glow, then it burned, then it killed. But still, they wore it, because it worked. And the mirror, now polished and ornate, did not argue. It showed them what they wanted to see: youth, control, elegance, worth. Beneath the mask, the skin cracked, wounds refused to heal, teeth loosened, hair thinned, muscles twitched without reason. The signs of poisoning were mistaken for aging, and the solution: more cires, more mask. Always more. The same lead paste that crowned queens also filled their coffins. And yet, beauty flourished in the age of death. Italy was not alone. In England, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, wore thick white paint to hide smallpox scars. Her crimson lips were drawn high and sharp, lined with vermilion, a mercury-based pigment. Her hairline was plucked high, her cheeks powdered with crushed pearls. She became a living icon. And behind the image was illness. She lost her appetite, her vision dimmed, her skin bruised. But to the world, she remained the glory Anna, the untouchable figure carved in light, because even queens feared the mirror when it told the truth. So they silenced it, covered it, commanded it to lie. And it did. Every morning, as the brushes scraped skin, as the powders were pressed into open pores, as the rouge brought false color to cold flesh, the mirror obeyed. It showed them beauty, even as it swallowed them slowly, even as death painted the final mask. The chamber was quiet before dawn, only the shuffle of slippers, the soft click of glass jars. A young noble woman sat before her mirror, her maid moving around her like a shadow, mixing, dabbing, brushing. Outside, bells tolled faintly across the hills of Florence, but here, within thick stone walls, time stood still. She would be married today, and she could not look like herself. The transformation began with the skin, white, that was the demand. As pale as ivory, as untouched as a statue, her maid pressed the Venetian cerus into her cheeks and forehead, down the length of her neck. The lead paste stung slightly, it always did, but it gave her the porcelain look she had been taught to desire since childhood. Next came the eyes, darkened with coal, rimmed with ash. Her lashes were painted with soot and egg white, her brows plucked into two thin lines, then redrawn higher, more arched, more obedient. Then the lips. Red as blood, crimson as sacrifice. The pigment came from cinnabar mercury sulfide. It gleamed in the lamplight, a final touch of life on a face that no longer breathed like skin. When she stood, she looked perfect, like a painting, but her stomach churned, her breath was shallow, and already her skin had begun to itch beneath the mask. This was beauty. Now, not expression, not health, but controlled. In courts across Europe, the faces of women were rehearsed, not just painted but practiced. A noble woman learned to smile with her eyes, to lower her chin at the right angle, to speak with her mouth barely parted so her painted lips did not crack. She learned to move slowly, so the powder would not flake. She learned to sit upright, even when faint, and she learned to endure. Because behind the luxury, there was expectation. A royal bride was not chosen for her voice. She was chosen for her womb, her alliances, and her face. If she failed to please, her fate turned cold. If her beauty faded, so did her protection. So she painted harder, rouged her cheeks before sickness could drain them, added pearls to her hair so her glow would reach farther. And every evening, she wiped it all away, often with vinegar. Sometimes with wine. Sometimes with tears underneath. Her skin was raw, but she never complained, because pain was not permitted in a beautiful woman, and aging was treated like betrayal. So they masked it. Some used silk veils dipped in milk, tied tight across their cheeks to lift the flesh. Others smeared wax beneath their eyes to smooth wrinkles. Some even stitched thread beneath their scalp to pull back the forehead. None of it lasted, but for a night. It was enough. And always, the mirror stood silent. It watched generations of women prepare themselves to be seen, to be judged, to be possessed. It did not ask if they were well. It did not warn them of the lead creeping into their blood. It only asked, "Do you look the way they want you to?" And if the answer was yes, the world called them beautiful, even as the color faded from their lips, even as their hands began to tremble, even as their bones began to ache. They smiled and returned to the mirror the next day. She opened the drawer beneath her writing desk. Inside, wrapped in linen and tied with a red thread, was the book. Its pages smelled of oil and dust. The handwriting was delicate, looping passed down from a grandmother who'd copied it from a noble woman's maid who had once served a duchess. It was not a book of prayers. It was a book of beauty. In the Renaissance, such books were hidden, not because they were forbidden, but because they were precious. Each recipe had been tested. Each line carried years of quiet pain. These were not spells. Not myths. They were instructions for survival. She turned the pages carefully to soften the skin. One read. To bring a flush to the cheek without paint. To calm a fevered face. To cool the breath. To whiten the hand. And in the margins, small warnings. Too much will sting. Only before sundown. Never during the bleeding days. These recipes were half science, half faith. They blended the old world of herbs with the new curiosity of alchemy. A little myrrh, crushed pearl, goat's milk, saffron, powdered coral, honey left overnight under moonlight. Some worked, some harmed. But all promised the same thing, to control the mirror. Among the wealthy, beauty manuals grew more elaborate. Some were written in Latin to hide their purpose. Others were bound in velvet, placed beside prayer books because to care for the body was, in some circles, rebranded as discipline, as devotion. But for most women, it was private and urgent. They made paste from dried violets and vinegar, powders from chalk and bone. They plucked their hairline and applied cold stones to their cheeks to reduce swelling from long nights. They boiled oranges in milk to rinse their faces. They pressed damp linen between their teeth to make them appear whiter. It was not always graceful. Sometimes it was desperate, because beauty faded quickly and youth even faster. And for many, youth was their only protection. But even as they sought it, they feared what it took. Some knew the pain in their joints was from the cirrus. They watched their friends waste away, slowly, skin thinning, memory fogging. They whispered of the girl whose gums bled until she could no longer smile, of the widow who kept applying powder, even as her fingernails fell out. But no one stopped, because there was no alternative. To go barefaced was to be dismissed. To age naturally was to disappear. To say no was to say goodbye to invitations, to suitors, to influence. So they continued. They kept the jars behind curtains, the recipes in drawers, the stains off their collars. They learned to cry without ruining the powder, to sleep with their head tilted so the paint would not smear, to drink broth through cloths so the red on their lips would stay sharp. And all the while, the mirror said nothing. It watched, faithfully, as they turned themselves into art. As they faded into their portraits. As they became silent masterpieces framed in flesh and powdered in poison. The portrait still hangs in the gallery. A woman in velvet, her eyes dark, unreadable, her skin impossibly smooth, her lips shaped in a secret smile. Viewers pass by, admiring the artistry, the light, the colors. They marvel at how flawless she looks, but no one asks what it cost her. She was real. Once, she bled. Once, she wept. Once. Now, only her image remains. This was the legacy of Renaissance beauty. It lived longer than the women who wore it. It became lawn paint. The ideal face, young, white, still, no pores, no age, no emotion, just radiance, composure, silence. And so, generation after generation, women compared themselves to the canvas. To something that never lived, and the pressure to match it never faded. Behind palace walls, noble women died slowly. Their deaths were not dramatic. They did not scream. They did not protest. They simply faded, lost weight, lost teeth, lost memory, but still showed up to court with powdered cheeks and shining lips. They smiled as their bones ached. As their hearts weakened. As their reflections blurred. Some tried to stop. A few brave women tossed out their jars, refused the rouge, let their hair grow wild. But the world was not kind. Whispers followed them through rooms. Invitations stopped. Suitors turned away. Physicians were called, assuming madness, because to abandon beauty was to abandon one's place. Even the women who mastered it, who used their appearance as power, paid a price. They were admired, but never trusted. They were desired, but rarely believed. They were envied, but always watched. If they aged, they were forgotten. If they remained radiant too long, they were feared. And so, they walked a razor's edge, between reverence and ruin, between glowing and ghostly. Even servants learned the rules. Maids mixed the syrups in silence. Nurses wiped away vomit from poisoned mouths without speaking. Dressers painted bruised skin before it was seen. Everyone knew. No one said a word, because the illusion had to hold, even as the body failed beneath it, even as the mind wandered, even as death crept quietly behind the painted lips. And still, the mirror remained. It stood in corners of royal rooms, in boudoirs, in halls. It was no longer a simple bronze circle. It was carved, framed in gold, larger now, hung with pride, a symbol of wealth, of taste. But its voice was the same. Soft, demanding, cold. Do you still look the way they want you to? If yes, you were safe for a little while. If no, the world moved on without you. The funeral procession moved through the courtyard in silence. Pale petals were scattered on the stone floor. Bells rang, soft and low. Inside the chapel, candles flickered against gold-trimmed walls. The air was heavy with incense and something else. Powder. Before the coffin was closed, the attendants had gathered. They worked quietly, as they had, in life. A final layer of white lead to the cheeks, a touch of red to the lips. The hair was arranged just so. Rings placed on the fingers, lash darkened with a brush of soot. She would be beautiful, even in death, because beauty was no longer just for the living. It had become a requirement of remembrance. To die unadorned was to be forgotten, but to die glowing, that was legacy, that was grace. That was what they would talk about long after. They would say, "She looked so peaceful. So perfect. So young. No one would say, "She suffered. She faded slowly beneath the paint. She feared the mirror." They would only remember the mask, and that was how the Renaissance ended for many women. Not in rebellion, not in freedom, but in silence, in ceremony, in portraits that lied, in graves that held powdered faces and poisoned bones. The mirror survived. It moved from palace to museum. It watched as fashions changed, as powders lost their sting, as time replaced lead with light. But the pressure never truly faded. The ghost of that old perfection lingered in the glass. Even now, the mirror remembers the quiet girls in their chambers, the queens beneath their wigs, the wives who wore rouge to hide their bruises, the widows who dabbed pearl dust to soften their sorrow, the maids who wept as they painted the dead. All of them lived inside the ritual, a soft war with time, a daily act of defense, a kind of hope, even when it hurt, because the desire never truly vanished. To be radiant. To be remembered. To be seen. And in that silent glow, in the final painted breath, the mask of the Renaissance finally closes its eyes.